Okay, Brian, so now you've seen the video, is there anything you want to say?
Quite hard to speak.
But tell us, how do you feel about the video and being exposed as the huge fraud that you are?
Now that is actually beginning to feel quite unpleasant.
I can imagine it is. Now, do you have anything at all that you can bring to the party to prove gravity?
My head is extremely heavy.
Well, with respect, Brian, I'm not sure that's an answer that really tells us anything.
But my head and my face feel very, very heavy.
So, how are you feeling about the general theory of relativity and special relativity now, Brian?
Very foggy.
Presumably then, Brian, you don't want the YouTube video to stay.
Take it down.
Well, thanks for the interview, Brian. Before you go, any more wise words for us at all? Righto then.
This is NASA's Space Power Facility near Cleveland, Ohio, and it is the world's biggest vacuum chamber. It's used to test spacecraft in the conditions of outer space, and it does that by pumping out the 30 tons of air in this chamber until there are about 2 grams left.
So, Brian enlightening us here and telling us that there's 30 tons of air in that chamber. Now, that 30 tons, according to Brian at modern day physics, is actually pushing on him from every direction, and it's the equivalent of about 14.7 pounds per square inch of pressure, or over the whole body that's roughly the amount of pressure on air pushing down on you of a small car. So that air would instantly crush us were it not for one thing. We actually impart motion, so when we move, what apparently is happening, according to modern day physics, is the huge weight of air pushes against another huge weight of air, and that is the only way we're able to move. I'm saying with 100% certainty it is ourselves that are able to displace the air very easily, and it is not the air that allows our movement. We can move through the air with great ease. But the problem is, gravity is supposed to be pushing everything to the ground, and yet we don't feel any air being pushed to the ground above us. And one of the explanations given to this is because we have this enormous amount of force pushing in all directions, and you would be crushed instantaneously like a gnat if it wasn't for this magical force in the air pushing back, which of course I don't believe. I'm contrary to that idea because it goes against everything in common sense. If you're in some sort of storm and you can see that the winds are blowing, the trees are leaning over, things are flying past you, litter, rubble, and yet we're supposed to believe that at the same time that mass of air that we can so clearly see observing in a completely different way is at the same time supposed to be pushing on us from every direction equally. It makes absolutely no sense, and it only takes a few moments and common sense to say that's a complete lie, but it's a necessary lie for their fiction. So what we are told is that we have a combined weight of air, the combined weight of the elements in the air, pushing on us in all directions. We cannot actually move in the face of this air. All we can do is quote unquote impart motion. So I can only rely on a huge mass of air to act as a counterforce to the air I'm pushing against. Problem being, everything we observe, we can see how the weight of the air is acting, and therefore we can know it is not acting in the way we are told.
And it's kind of got an eccentric construction, which is part of its history. It was built in the 1960s as a nuclear test facility to test nuclear propulsion systems, and that meant that they built it out of aluminium to make the radiation easier to deal with. Aluminium is not the best thing, the strongest material to build a vacuum chamber out of. So They built an outer concrete skin, which is part radiation shielding and part an external pressure vessel, so that this thing can take the force that's present on the outside when it's pumped out to the conditions of outer space. Galileo's experiment was simple. He took a heavy object and a light one and dropped them at the same time to see which fell fastest. Now in this case, the feathers fell to the ground at a slower rate than the bowling ball because of air resistance. So in order to see the true nature of gravity, we have to remove the air. It takes 3 hours to pump out the 800,000 cubic feet of air from the chamber.
Okay, we dropped 2 millitorr in the last 30 minutes.
But once it's complete, there's a near perfect vacuum inside.
6104 manual, 10% open. Station 1, go for drop. PCV 30-1, pressure set point at 240 psi. We are go for drop.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4. Cameras on. 2, 1, release.
Look at that.
They came down exactly the same. Wow.
Look.
That's right there. Look at how they hit right there.
Exactly.
You're back on the side.
Exactly the same.
Feathers don't move, nothing.
Look at that. That's just brilliant. Isaac Newton would say that the ball and the feather fall because there's a force pulling them down, gravity. But Einstein imagined the scene very differently. The happiest thought of his life was this. The reason the bowling ball and the feather fall together is because they're not falling. They're standing still. There is no force acting on them at all.
Right, I've got an idea, okay, but it does require, well, it's a theory of mine, if I'm honest, but it does require that we think generally, right? Now, when I say that, I do mean relatively as well. So let me ask you, what do you think of my idea? Because I just explained the general theory of relativity to you, right? Because that's an unanswerable thing. If my idea is a general theory and it's relative, it will never be answered. It can never be answered. It's a linguistic conundrum. It's not a scientific breakthrough. It's a Hegelian dialectic masterpiece, and I'm afraid it's ridiculous.
He reasoned that if you couldn't see the background, there'd be no way of knowing that the ball and the feathers were being accelerated towards the Earth. So he concluded they weren't.
Okay, let me try and highlight the obvious fraud in this experiment. How they have done it is they have taken this shot that we can see here now. They have dropped the bowling ball and the feathers literally just above, off camera, and they have run that footage back through. Once they have done that, they've captured a still image around about here. So once again, what they've done is they've just dropped the bowling ball and feathers just off shot. In editing software, they've captured this still image of the event, which is obviously just before the feathers are literally just touching and the bowling ball is obviously about to hit. And they've captured this still image and they've used it for the entirety of the experiment. Okay, so using that knowledge, let's just play the experiment back and see. First thing to observe here at the beginning of the shot is we have the bowling ball and the wire coming out the top is slightly higher than the feather. Now, just before it leaves screen, we can see that it is no longer, it's off shot before the feather. Also, the feather is moving. You can see that air must be interacting with that feather, otherwise it would not move in that manner. But we move to the next shot because there's only 3 shots here. Now here's where they've taken the still image from their experiment, and farcically all they've done is just, as I say, use that still image. Now we conveniently, how conveniently we cut before we see the impact. Then we can see the still image that they've used coming in. It's around about, obviously, about just before then, obviously, that the still image was captured, round about here. Then they've resumed the original footage, and of course then we can see things acting very differently. For example, now we see movement in the feathers once again, which can only be due to the air. We also notice that the feathers propelled further up in the air than the bowling ball. So this is contrary to everything that we've just been explained by Professor Cox. They're propelled, some of those feathers are even reaching out of screen, whereas the bowling ball remains stuck. And in fact, if it wasn't for the fact that conveniently the British Brainwashing Corporation have cut this and ended the program, we would see the bowling ball using its own weight to descend more rapidly than the feathers.
He reasoned that if you couldn't see the background, there'd be no way of knowing that the ball and the feathers were being accelerated towards the Earth. So he concluded they weren't.
Son, now that you're going out into the world, there's something you should know. You see that? Yeah? That's shit. And this is shinola.
Shit. Shinola.
Son, you're gonna be all right.